Also car design forever. First, Rubens Barrichello crashed spectacularly in practice. But despite becoming airborne, he wasn't seriously injured. The next day, Roland Ratzenberger also crashed and tragically became the first driver to be killed in more than a decade. The drivers, led by Ayrton Senna, met to consider the safety implications. The race went ahead, but was immediately marred at the start with another accident, this time when Pedro Lamy hit the stalled car of J.J. Leyton. Senna led from Michael Schumacher after the restart, when suddenly he veered off the track at massive speed. Despite the best efforts of the medical team, the collision with a concrete wall cost him his life and shocked the world. Speaking for the drivers, a young Michael Schumacher.
The only thing I can say about this is I hope we learn from this. I think there is a lot to learn from, and we have to use this. And things like this, they shouldn't happen without taking the experience from it.
Before the start of the next meeting in Monaco, the drivers held a minute's silence in memory of their two friends, perhaps contemplating how close they'd all been to tragedy. If one of the greatest ever drivers, Senna, could crash and die, how safe were they? And when Karl Wendlinger crashed, coming into the chicane, the authorities were forced into swift and decisive action. FIA chief Max Mosley, a former racing driver and Formula One team boss from the deadly days of the 60s and 70s, was determined that such a weekend would never happen again.
One was used to it 25 years ago, because it was a frequent occurrence. But it's always a terrible thing when you know somebody you know well and like suddenly gets killed. It really is bad, and it happened to me so often before. And of course, when you're in a position where, in a sense, you're responsible, then it has even bigger effect.
For Formula One, the future of a multi-million-pound industry was in the balance, unless they made it safe.
We reduced the capacity of the engine. We changed the aerodynamics of the cars to slow them down in the corners. We improved the resistance of the cars to the crash, both side and front, and then later rear. A lot of protection for the head and neck, and a combination of those things, but probably principally the head and neck protection, certainly saved Verstappen when he had his big accident at Spa, and probably saved 3 other drivers who had serious accidents recently. There's no doubt they are now walking away from accidents that would have either been a very serious head injury or possibly fatal. There will always be forms of accident that you could do nothing about. The ordinary racing accident, we can still do better. Schumacher shouldn't have broken his leg. But on the other hand, a few years ago, he'd have killed himself. So in that sense, it's better, but there's still room for improvement. I don't think anybody wants to see a driver get hurt. They don't mind seeing a big accident, probably quite entertaining, but on condition the driver jumps out the car at the end and walks away.
Driving these vital safety changes was a working group set up by Mosley after the tragic events of the Imola circuit in San Marino. He asked renowned driver Gerhard Berger to join. Berger had also had a close call at the same track.
I had a very big accident in 1989 in Imola where I nearly died. And from this day on, I realized how dangerous it can be. I mean, you have accidents where you make, as a driver, a mistake, and you still can say to yourself, okay, this mistake I'm never going to do anymore and never going to happen anymore. So you feel quite confident. But you can have a technical failure like I had. And you know that can happen always again because it's not in your hands. And then all what you are is a passenger. So I think accidents like this change your mind in a big way.
But soon that group was working on much more than racing safety.
We said, well, okay, maybe we haven't had an accident, but there are an enormous number of people being killed on the roads every day. So presumably the governments of the various countries have got huge research programs going. We must get our experts to look at that. So our experts looked, and to their horror and amazement, we found that there had been no change in the European crash tests since 1974. So there we were 20 years later with the same old crude crash test, whereas we'd been upgrading our crash tests in Formula One really rapidly the whole time. And that's what made us realize that there'd been complete negligence in this area, and we needed to become involved as the World Federation of Big Motoring Clubs.
The FIA began intensive lobbying for a change in European law so that the government crash test for road cars could be updated, and that was achieved in just 1 year. They also devised their own tests that simulated real accidents as an incentive for safety-conscious manufacturers. The tests are both thorough and independent because each car is bought anonymously from a dealer. They pull no punches.
The passenger compartment of the Hyundai Atos collapsed in on the occupants. The performance of the Honda logo was disappointing, especially for a new model. The body shell performance for the Lancia Epsilon was poor, with one of the main pillars splitting completely open.
But proof that the industry has responded can be seen in the results for these Super Minis. When they were first tested, this category performed very poorly indeed. Yet 3 years later, a significant number achieved the maximum 4-star award. We are now better protected in our cars than ever before, and it's largely down to the experience of Formula One and the bravery of the crash test racers.
Oh, thank God for ABS brakes.
Safety, as much as performance, is a feature the manufacturers know will sell their cars. And the sports governing body, the FIA, are now looking at improvements for side-on accidents and head protection. Very much a road car and racing agenda. So the bond between manufacturer and racing is getting even closer. The FIA also takes careful note of every driver's opinion. Even a comparative rookie like Ricardo Zonta, who's already survived 3 major crashes.
They should make the car a little bit bigger. I know it will be slowly, but it's not that dangerous for the drivers. And also make the suspension in steel material. I'm really happy if I can use everything just to save my life.
Moss is fighting to make up the lost miles. He's already left world champion Fangio behind.
Safety was never a part of racing. I think it has to have a bit of danger. I think that's part of the ingredient of making the sport what it was.
Sir Sterling's reluctance to wear a safety belt dates from a time when racing cars were lethal. The rigid tubular steel frame without crumple zones was very strong, but so inflexible that the driver took the full force of impact. The same car might be raced again only days after a fatal crash, with a new man at the wheel. The cars were front-engined, and so the risk of fire and even explosion was great. The drivers of that era put their faith in being thrown clear. Contemporaries like Von Trips and Peter Collins had already perished when Moss had his first and last huge accident.
Then for Sterling Moss came tragedy. He crashed trying to overtake Graham Hill near St Mary's Bend. Number 7 was not lucky this time. As we go to press, Sterling Moss is reported still unconscious.
Moss made a complete recovery, but retired shortly after that accident in 1962. He has the greatest admiration for the drivers that have followed him, but thinks that the huge improvements in vehicle and track safety have contributed to a decline in driver behaviour.
There's no place for humility now because the ethics have changed. I mean, 2 of the best drivers in the world, Prost and Senna, pushing each other off at 175 miles an hour. Now, I'm sure if they'd been racing at Fangio's time, they wouldn't even have thought about it. I mean, it wouldn't be in their mind.
I do accept that the drivers are prepared to bump wheels, and I do believe that they do take quite heavy risks. Drivers in Sterling's time took greater risks, but I think the drivers now are more prepared to have contact with other cars that would have just been not considered at all 40 years ago.
When I was racing, I remember Sir Jack Brabham lending me a part from his spare car, knowing very well it might help me to beat him. That wouldn't happen today. I mean, can you imagine, McLaren saying to Ferrari, listen, you need this part, please be our guest? I mean, no way.
We're generally a pretty selfish industry, I think. We're 11 or 12 teams competing absolutely flat out against each other, and if you take your eye off the ball, I think we'd probably go backwards on the track relative to the other teams.
Naked competition on the track may be excusable, even part and parcel of the sport. But out on the open road, it's downright dangerous. Aggression and a total lack of patience have no part to play in good driving practice. and will be punished by the authorities. What's more, skilled F1 drivers know how to control their high-powered machines. And however safe our cars are made, the one factor that turns a perfectly benevolent machine into a lethal weapon is the person behind the wheel. You and me.
When you get in the car, you are the only person who's there pushing your foot down. Nobody's prodding you to go quicker. You make yourself go quicker, your pride, whatever you want to call it. And when you're driving a car, the car is giving you a message. You know what it's saying, but you then got to back it up by knowing what to do. And knowing what to do comes from experience, it comes from feel, it comes from many, many things.
Some critics say that all these safety devices, because they take the risk out of racing, also take the fun out of it.
Well, I don't know if this is a normal people what thinking in this way, because I mean, yeah, I can try to jump from this roof, and maybe some people would like to see it when I touch down on the ground, but I don't think this is a normal attitude. The normal attitude is that racing is a fantastic sport, it's a high competitive sport, but nobody really likes to see people hurt.